If you look at modern-day Spain, it is easy to forget the frantic and hostile nature of the country. In the modern era, Spain forms part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and signs of war are virtually nowhere. But what many people might not know is less than 8 decades ago, Spain was facing massive international sanctions and restrictions. In fact, the neutral country of Spain was actively supporting the Axis forces during World War II, but simultaneously, it was receiving massive bribes from the Allied powers. But with hundreds of thousands of men losing their lives and Spanish citizens fighting on both sides of the war, why did Hitler spare Spain in the face of direct betrayal? Join us today as we dive deeper into the neutrality of Spain and find out how a diplomatic masterstroke from Spanish leader Franco might have saved a nation already reeling from civil war. We explore how this stroke of genius possibly saved the Spanish Empire from total collapse in the 20th century. Once the Second World War broke out, Spain was still hundreds of miles from the front line. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1940 that the Axis powers could come even close to seeing the borders of the Spanish Empire. However, the whole world was already in a position of choosing sides, and while countries like Great Britain would immediately declare their support for France, with the United States following suit, the pressure was on the Spanish leader to make a decision. Unfortunately, making such a decision was not as easy as signing on the dotted line. You see, even before the war started, Spain had a debt of $212 million for supplies the Germans provided during the Spanish Civil War, a devastating period in Spanish history, marked by numerous human rights violations. But the most surprising fact is that from the beginning of the war, Spain already favored the Axis powers, and by the time the French capital of Paris fell into Nazi hands, the Spanish was ready to strike a deal of full allegiance with the Germans. You see, during World War II, Spain was under the control of an autocratic government that would lean more toward the ideology of the Axis powers. However, the inner workings of the Spanish government were more complex, and it was divided between Germanophiles and Anglophiles, which essentially meant that the Spanish government wasn't completely on board with the German invasion. In fact, Franco replaced his Minister of Foreign Affairs no fewer than 2 times, each depending on how the war was going. After a few initial German victories, Franco chose a Germanophile minister, but after the successful North African campaign by the Allies in 1942, it was back to an Anglophile, with pro-British Francisco Gómez Jordana Sousa becoming Minister of Foreign Affairs. However, Franco also had ambitions to actively enter the war, and it was in August 1940 that Hitler first became serious about Spain entering the war. Nevertheless, the German demand for air and naval bases in Spanish Morocco and the Canaries was something Franco opposed, significantly angering the German Führer. The two did meet for the first time in the town of Hadiyih on October 23, 1940, but by then, the benefits of entering the war had become less clear for both sides. In fact, Hitler believed that Franco was asking too much. His demand for full fortification of the Canary Islands, large quantities of grain, and military equipment aggravated the Nazi dictator. In fact, Hitler even threatened a possible annexation of the Spanish territory, which meant that no agreement was reached. Hitler was so enraged, he famously told Benito Mussolini, "I prefer to have 3 or 4 of my teeth pulled out than speak to that man again." It is heavily debated whether this was a masterstroke by Francisco Franco to overplay his hand and aggravate the German leader to such a degree that Hitler would forgo any attempts of Spain entering the war. It might have possibly saved the Spanish nation from another war post-Civil War. But the Germans and Allies both needed access to a geographical point controlled by the Spanish Empire. At the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, you will come across the British territory of Gibraltar. The territory is only around 2.6 square miles, but served as an important foothold on the European continent for British sea power. Its main purpose was to control traffic coming in and out of the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean, essentially trying to box the Germans and Axis powers in. To prove to Hitler that Spain was ready to fight alongside the Axis, Franco threatened to retake Gibraltar from the British with 2 million soldiers ready to go. However, nothing came of these veiled threats, as Franco realized that a blockage of Spanish ports reducing imports of oil would heavily affect the Spanish economy, and nothing came from the threat. But speaking of oil and natural resources, we should also look at why Spain never declared war on the Allies. Even though Spain jumped between absolute neutrality and non-belligerence, Spain had become heavily reliant on the West for survival, especially once the Civil War was done. One of their major imports was oil coming from the United States, but the US would have to follow British recommendations on this matter, which meant Spain would be restricted to only a 10-week reserve of oil. This meant that Spain had to rely on German oil if they were to support a strong navy, but the Germans already relied on captured French oil reserves. For the time being, Spain could remain neutral, allowing numerous bribes from MI6 to take place and becoming a hub for espionage activities between the British and Germans. In fact, Franco also signed numerous secret trade agreements with the Germans as well, to keep them happy whilst receiving funds from the British. However, things were about to change and Hitler needed resources and support again. Despite lacking cash, oil, and most other supplies, Franco would still supply the Germans with essential materials throughout the war, with tungsten being the primary export for Francoist Spain. Payment for these materials would eventually be set against the Spanish debt already owed to Germany from the Civil War. But Hitler remained adamant that having Spain join in a military capacity was of utmost importance. You see, Germany was already stretched quite thin while fighting on the Eastern and Western Front, which completely ruled out any invasion in the south. Hitler would arrange a meeting between Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and Franco on February 12, 1941, hoping that Mussolini could convince Franco to cut all ties with the Allies. However, Mussolini was facing a series of defeats in North Africa and the Balkans, putting the Italians on the back foot and removing any interest from Mussolini. But it wasn't until Franco signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, a pact that would aim to eradicate communism, and with the German invasion of Russia that Spain would slowly enter the war. A new Spanish war division, called the Blue Division, would enter as Spain publicly declared the Soviet Union guilty of the Spanish War. Recruitment for the Blue Division kicked off on June 27, 1941, with 18,373 men volunteering by July 2nd of the same year. It was mainly made up of Falangist volunteers, with a fifth being students. Since this wasn't an official part of the Spanish military, the use of Spanish uniforms was out of the question. So, the Blue Division had to settle for the red berets of the Carlists, khaki trousers of the Spanish Legion, and blue shirts of the Phalangists, hence the name Blue Division. In an attempt not to aggravate the West, it was decided that the Blue Division would only fight on the Eastern Front. This move significantly angered Joseph Stalin at the time, but the Blue Division did eventually help in the siege of Leningrad, managing to hold it for more than a year. However, as the war became more intense, the Allies and conservative Spaniards pressured Franco to withdraw troops from the quasi-alliance with Germany. By November of 1944, Franco had ordered a full withdrawal, but around 3,000 volunteers would remain and join various branches of the German military. By the end of the war, many were held as political prisoners, remaining in Soviet custody until the eventual death of Stalin in 1954. But during the whole invasion, not a single Spanish town was invaded, and while the rest of Europe burned to the ground, Spain was becoming a hub for both the Allied and Axis powers. Franco would continue to run Spain post-World War II under what we know today as the Francoist dictatorship, and after a massive recession, Franco oversaw an economic boom from 1959 until he died in 1975. However, historians do believe that nothing of this would have been possible if it wasn't for Franco playing the line of neutrality during World War II. What do you think?